everyone, this is Millie Ray, and this is a recap of a presentation I did at a reading conference on September 13th, 2014. It was held at Concordia University of Chicago in association with the West Suburban Reading Council. At the time of the presentation, I wanted to acquaint you with my experience, and I thought I would do the same here. I started my experience as a writing instructor when I received an MA from Columbia University Teachers College in New York City in applied linguistics and teaching English to speakers of other languages. So my experience in teaching writing began with college students and community college students who needed support in learning English as a second language. Then my career really took off when I was at the University of Chicago, or since I've been at the University of Chicago, and teaching the writing principles there through the writing program. And I've had the pleasure of teaching undergraduates, graduate students, professionals, staff, various and sundry people. And during my time at the University of Chicago, I also had the opportunity to teach high school kids who were seeking enrichment classes over the summer. And I saw that they actually could use these principles that we teach at the University of Chicago to do writing that's effective for college and career. And from there, it got me thinking about the kinds of things that we can offer perhaps kids who are even younger. So that's where I got the idea that perhaps these writing principles would be helpful for kids in the 6th to 12th grades. Beyond that, I've also worked with younger kids. I developed a debate club at a private school in the north side of Chicago where we talked very explicitly about argumentation. And I developed a school-wide K-8 writing curriculum at a Chicago public school. And finally, I'm currently in the process of developing an enrichment writing class for kids in the 4th through 5th grade levels for a couple of private schools on the north side of Chicago. So I believe very strongly in applying principles at a higher level for kids who are just developing their writing skills. And I think what you're going to see today is going to help you a great deal in informing your instruction, particularly around argument. So without further ado, let's begin. Writing for College and the Common Core, University of Chicago Writing, Principles, Product, and Process. Okay, let's get started. All right, well, during the presentation, I wanted to put us all on the same page, and so I navigated to the website for the Common Core Standards in Writing in order to pick out specific anchor skills that we would be focusing on in this presentation and that I thought were particularly relevant with regard to the principles that I teach at the University of Chicago. I won't go to that URL now, but I put it here just so that you would have a reference for it, and if you need to see it at some point, you can just cut and paste, or I guess type it in, whatever is most appropriate. Okay, so let's address these anchor skills. All right, so the anchor skills that we highlighted from that page were the following, and I abbreviate them here. The first is argue, inform, and explain. Argue is considered to be an important skill for kids to be prepared for college and career, and that is absolutely correct. That is probably the most sophisticated thing that scholars do, is make an argument, and it sure would help for kids at a young age to be thinking in those terms. The second anchor skill that we see here is produce clear text by using proper organization. And this particular skill actually matches up really well with the University of Chicago writing principles, because those principles really are a product-based approach. In other words, the principles that we teach at the University of Chicago discuss explicit rhetorical moves, structures, and organization that readers need in order to perceive clarity in a text. So the principles already lend themselves to product. Finally, we see plan, strengthen, and revise texts. And that implies process. And even though the principles at the University of Chicago do not necessarily address process, I argue that we can, in fact, take these principles and use them as tools for planning, strengthening, and revising texts. And we'll get to that at the end of this presentation, or toward the end of this presentation. All right, so let's talk about argument. University of Chicago writing principles, argument. We break argument down into the following 4 components, essentially: claim, grounds, warrant, reader response, and doubt. And I'll go through each of these individually and provide definitions. in your teaching, in your district, or in your school, you may refer to these different aspects of argument in different ways, but this is the terminology we use, and I think after hearing the definitions or even just seeing them listed, you'll probably be able to translate them, these terms, into the terms that you use. So let's start with claim. All right, so claim, we say, is a contestable statement. Essentially, it's a statement that some readers may doubt or some readers may need some proof of. So for example, a claim like "the sky is blue" a sentence like "the sky is blue" does not rise to the level of claim. It's not contestable, at least not on a sunny day anyway. So it's important to note that whatever claim that you're using, or what, excuse me, I keep saying that, whatever sentence you're using and that you would like to represent a claim needs to be something that some reader somewhere will doubt, or some reader somewhere will need specific evidence or explanation as to why it should be believed. So here's another example. Here's an example of a sentence that would rise to the level of claim. If I were to say to you that in my research I found that kids who learn how to read by the age of 8 write more effective arguments at the age of 10. So that kind of a statement, a reader might say, okay, I might not doubt it, but I sure want to see how you were able to prove that. So basically that rises to the level of claim, because I would have to show what it is that I found that would lead me to make that kind of claim and that I could support. Okay, the next component of argument is grounds. And grounds comes in two varieties. There's reasons and there's evidence. And reasons are arrived at through logical thinking, right? Versus evidence that, as you'll notice, has vid in it, which is, from the Latin to see, and so and is considered stronger. So evidence is generally considered stronger than reasons, but both are employed to support a claim. So you can argue something logically, or you can provide specific data, in many cases statistics, even though you have to be careful with statistics because sometimes they can be abused, but that's a bone I won't pick right now. But anyway, you always have to have reasons and evidence. Okay, finally, the next point we have is warrant. Well, the warrant is interesting because it's the principle that lets the reader know how the grounds are related to the claim and how the grounds actually support the claim. It's the underlying principle. And we'll see examples of that in a moment. Warrants are important because they make sure that readers and writers are on the same page, that they share conceptions of what might lead, of how one thing leads to another. And this is particularly important to take note of, especially since we are often of a different generation from our students who might actually see causality or relationships differently from the way that we would look at them. So we have to pay special attention to warrant, and I'll be getting to that in the next couple of slides. Finally, and I've already been talking about this, is reader response or doubt. When making an effective argument, you have to imagine the places where readers might say, wait a minute, I don't buy that. And in those cases, you have to know, you have to be able to provide evidence to allay their doubts. You have to anticipate where they're not going to be on board with what you're saying. You have to anticipate some counter arguments. And so this is a very important part of creating an argument. All right, because it's the back and forth. Okay. So basically, taking all of these things together, we realize that making an argument is actually having a conversation. Of course, when a writer sits down to write, that person is usually alone. The reader is not in the room. But the writer still has to imagine how the reader would respond as if they were having a conversation. So that's an important point to keep in mind when we're teaching argument to younger students. All right, so now let's look at an example of an argument. First, let's look at an intuitive argument. Okay, and I'll explain why it's intuitive in a moment. Okay, so here we have a claim. Charlie Trotter's is an expensive restaurant. Okay, that's a claim. Some people may agree with that, some people may not. Okay, here's my evidence. A full course meal there is about $300 per person. Okay, warrant. Remember, that's the principle that makes explicit the relationship between the evidence and the claim. So here's the warrant. Whenever a restaurant charges $300 per person for a meal, then the restaurant is expensive. Okay, so the question is, do you buy that? Do you agree that when a meal costs $300 per person, that it is expensive? If you do, then the writer and the reader are on the same page. And you probably won't need to provide any more evidence, and you probably won't need to provide any more explanation. This is where warrants are important, but of course in this case, the argument is intuitive because in fact readers and writers would probably share this principle. They'd probably share this warrant without further explanation. So therefore, you would not need to actually state the warrant on the page, but you actually know how the claim is related to the evidence by using a principle like this. Okay. However, it's not so clear when warrants are not, how should we say, obvious, and that's going to be our next case. Okay, so here's an example of a counterintuitive argument. Okay, here's a claim. Saying I hate you to parents is a good thing. What? Are you out of your mind? How is it ever good for a kid to say I hate you to their parents? Okay, well, here are some reasons I'm giving you. Kids feel like they can say anything to their parents. Parents have made it safe for their kids to say anything. Okay, this may or may not be enough. You may or may not buy this argument. But then on the next slide, we'll see the warrant that ties the reasons to the claim. Okay, here's the warrant. Whenever kids say I hate you, it is a positive thing because it means that they feel safe enough to express difficult or even hurtful things, and they know that their parents will not abandon them. Okay, do you buy it now? You may or may not buy it, but it actually does show how the reasons are related to the claim. So in this type of argument, you probably would gain a lot of benefit from actually stating the warrant on the page. It actually allows the reader some additional information to see how it is that the writer is making what seems to be a very counterintuitive claim. So the important point to stress here is when writers suspect that readers might not be on the same page in terms of the relationship between grounds and claims, it would be helpful for the writer to actually put the warrant on the page. It would be helpful to make the warrant very explicit. I should also make another note, which is that it is possible for the reader to still not agree with this claim, in which case, at the very least, the reader would see that there is some kind of underlying principle that tied the claim to the grounds, and that the reader just wasn't, or excuse me, the writer wasn't just making some kind of crazy statement. So in spite of the fact that the reader may not be convinced, the reader can at least see that the argument was made on the basis of something, and perhaps even well argued. It's possible for arguments to be made and frankly not convince someone. Okay, so why did I go through all the trouble of going through all this process? Well, it's because I want to emphasize the fact that it's important for readers and writers to be on the same page. And at the level of argument, you can make sure to accomplish that through warrant work. Again, if it's an intuitive argument that's being made, you probably don't need to state the warrant on the page. However, if it's a counterintuitive argument, you probably do. Okay, so being on the same page helps readers understand the types of arguments that a writer wants to make. So on the next slide, I'm going to be talking about another set of principles that help structure entire texts and that could hopefully structure how a writer will construct an argument overall. So let's move on to that. Okay, so introductions, setting up a problem. Okay, at the University of Chicago, we teach the problem setup as an effective means of setting up an introduction to create interest in the reader in reading about an argument that a writer would like to make. Okay, and in developing this problem in an introduction, we think about the following components: stasis, destabilizing condition, consequences, solution, and claim. And I'm going to go through each of these components by slides, one component for each slide coming up, and explain what each component is and hopefully what it can do in a paper. All right, so setting up a problem, stasis. Okay, the stasis is a commonly held belief. It's the state of the art of the field. It's the way people have been doing things. It's what's understood, what's taken for granted on some level. Okay? This is an important thing to begin with because it actually lays some kind of groundwork for what it is that a writer will, I don't know, disagree with or try to convince a reader to change their ideas. So the writer needs to start with where the reader is, because this way the reader can perceive that the text is going to be actually speaking to them directly and related to their interests. So the stasis basically expresses what writers imagine that readers currently think about a particular topic. And if the writer gets it correct, that's really very helpful for making an argument. I also note here that cueing language helps signal it. And cueing language can take a variety of different forms, but I'll get more into that in the next slide. Okay, so setting up a problem, a destabilizing condition. So now you've successfully set up what you imagine a reader thinks about a particular topic. Then what you're going to do next is you're going to point out the limits of this belief. You're going to point out the flaws, the errors, what hasn't been taken into account, what gaps exist, what may have changed since this belief became solidified, those kinds of things. And basically, you're going to be using cueing language to signal destabilizing condition with words such as however and yet. And I'm sorry to be adding so much more information to this recap because I really want it to be the main points. But I think cueing language is really important also because cueing language is about the rhetorical moves that writers make to help readers understand their text and to read text the way that writers want them to. So it's very powerful to use these kinds of cueing words because they signal certain things to readers, and readers will get the idea that they're getting what they think they're getting, even if they might not exactly be. Okay, I hope that point isn't too obscure. If you have questions about that, you can certainly contact me and I can answer more questions about that. But just for this, for our purposes now, suffice it to say that, you know, cueing words are helpful rhetorical moves in helping readers navigate through a text, and ultimately in helping writers essentially force readers to read their text in a certain way. Okay, so next up is consequences. And just as there were two types of grounds, there are two types of consequences. So there are costs and benefits. And cost explains why the stasis is problematic, and benefits explain why the solution or claim is the way to go. This gives you the reason for changing what you originally believed in. So these benefits and costs answer the so what question. They answer the question of, hey, why should I believe what you're telling me to believe? Why should I alter my current beliefs? Okay, so that can be really powerful because it provides value to the argumentation that the reader is going to be reading. Okay, finally we have solution and claim, and I guess for our purposes we're going to talk about claim. I can get into more nuances. In fact, I've done a bit of a mashup of a couple of the principles that we teach at the University of Chicago, but I just want to highlight the idea that a claim can actually, if not outright solve the problem, it could actually bring things back into some kind of stability. Because when you have a stasis and you're shaking people up and you're saying, hey, don't believe what you currently believe because it's incomplete or inaccurate, you're basically shaking up their world. And so by the time you get to the claim, which is at the end, you will be, in a way, promising them that you're going to restore them to some sort of stability, right? So if they shouldn't believe what they believed in the past, they can now believe what you're asking them to believe now. Okay? And also, because it's the end of this setup, it basically tells the reader what the focus of the rest of the paper will be. Okay. So let me give you an example of this kind of a setup. And I'm going to repeat what I did at the presentation because I thought it really drove the point home. As I mentioned during the presentation, one day I was driving in my car and I had the radio on, and all of a sudden I hear a voice say, "You thought it was safe to take aspirin." And that was soon followed by, "However, new evidence suggests that there's more to taking aspirin than meets the eye. That was soon followed with, taking aspirin can cause illness or even death. Finally, the spot ended with, tune in at 10. Okay, so let's break this down. We talked about it during the session, but let's talk about it again here. So, the first statement, you thought it was safe to take aspirin. Well, that's a stasis. And we see the cueing language of you thought. That clearly signals that the reader has a belief. The reader is walking around with some idea about how aspirin works. And it's not fact because we say you thought. So that already begins the process of challenging what a reader believes to be true. Then that's followed up with, however, there's more to taking aspirin than meets the eye. Okay, the however, more cueing language. And that signals a destabilizing condition. There's a problem with the commonly held belief. There's a problem with the stasis. And the problem is that there's now new evidence that throws that stasis into doubt. We can now question it. Okay, next we hear, taking aspirin can cause illness and can be fatal. Okay, those are clearly costs, right? Those are costs to continuing to believe that taking aspirin is safe, because in fact, it isn't. They're claiming that it can cause illness and that you can die from taking it. So those consequences, in fact, are answering the so what question. Why does it matter for you to be hearing about aspirin? Why does it matter for you to be thinking different things from what you previously thought about aspirin? Okay. Finally, the last line is, tune in at 10. It's funny because we know that news programs often bring out these teasers and they're trying to get you to tune into their program at night. And so in this case, the solution or the claim is tune in at 11. And it's implicit, right? Because if you tune in at 10, I keep mixing up those times, but okay. Because in fact, it's implicitly stated that if you tune in at 10, that they're going to tell you how all this is true. Okay? They're basically going to make the case, and you know implicitly, that aspirin is not safe. Okay? But again, it's a teaser, so they're not going to give it all away. Okay, so what's interesting about that kind of spot is that we see that everywhere. So, in fact, this type of setup for a problem, for an introduction to a somewhat longer text, is something that we see all the time. Okay? And it would be very beneficial for our students, even sixth graders, to begin to start paying attention to this type of structure, because it really is around us all the time. All right. So, during the presentation, I gave you a couple of articles, and the point of giving you the articles was to help you identify these different components. But really, if you open up, a news magazine, like Time Magazine, Newsweek, you'll probably find this structure. You'll find this structure in larger magazine articles, virtually any type of article, Vanity Fair, even Cosmopolitan. You'll find this kind of structure everywhere, because they're trying to create value to convince readers to read the text and to believe what they, to have readers believe what they want them to believe. Okay. The other point I should be making in all of this, and I apologize for this unfortunate byproduct of presenting it this way, is that these components make it seem as though creating problems is a fairly formulaic exercise. And I confess that very often you will see the components of problem marching along in this linear fashion. And in fact, we might even allow our sixth graders and seventh graders, eighth graders, ninth graders to march along and do these components one by one in this way. However, if you look at the articles, the sample articles that I gave out to you during the presentation, or if you look at articles in the so-called real world, you'll see that sometimes these things take twists and turns. So for example, in one of the articles I gave you, the writer started with a solution or claim right from the beginning, and then later on went to the stasis. The person wanted to be provocative, and so they started with a claim, a very strong claim about the SAT being worthless. And then from there, going to what people commonly believe about the SAT and what's wrong with believing that in the SAT, and then the consequences of believing those things about the SAT. So you really don't need to be marching linearly in this fashion, okay? It's okay to let this take twists and turns. So my recommendation when you're teaching this to students is to, yeah, let them do it formulaically at first because they're learning it. But if you find texts where the cueing language is clear enough to help signal, the stasis, destabilizing condition, consequences, or solution or claim, then you can then give them a more complex exercise where they can identify cueing language so that they can identify these components and see how these things are actually applied in the real world, and that it's not actually a linear thing. So you have to promise me that if you're going to use this, that you keep that in mind. Let it be formulaic at first as people are learning it, but always let them know that it doesn't have to be, and that the writing can take, again, twists and turns that it needs to take in order to make sense. This is an important point because in college, very often we have to help students get beyond some of the formulas, like the 5-paragraph essay that they may have learned during their elementary and secondary education. And so we need to help free students. We need to give students the freedom or the safety of product, but also let them know that they can actually tinker with it, once they have some kind of understanding and familiarity with it. All right, so I'm going to get off the soapbox and stop talking about that point, but I just wanted to make sure that it was really important. You're going to have to promise me that you're going to be looking at it that way. Okay, so let's move. So that's the product portion of it. Let's move on to process. Okay, so as I mentioned, the University of Chicago writing principles really focus on product, right? They look at what readers need to perceive that a text is clear. That's clearly a product approach, okay? And our belief is that knowledge of product can be helpful in understanding where students have to get to. It actually helps inform, and in that way it can actually help inform their process. So these bullet points states that yes, they demonstrate product, yes, they give you an idea for a rhetorical structure that will organize and present the content of a paper, and knowledge of product can actually help writers or budding writers develop an effective process for revising, planning, and structuring texts. So let's see how we can do that. Okay, we can actually apply the stasis, destabilizing condition, consequences, solution, claim, structure to process by creating questions. Okay, so we can talk. So for example, if we want to come up with a stasis, we can clearly ask a student, what does my reader think about this process, about this topic? Writers will be asked to imagine what it is they think that their reader, and they do have to define a reader because frankly, not all claims work for all readers. And I should actually mention something that I didn't mention in a previous slide, particularly the aspirin example. The fact of the matter is not everyone takes aspirin, and not everyone believes that taking aspirin is a great thing. However, an effective argument about aspirin doesn't have to do that. It only has to reach people who believe that taking aspirin is a great thing. If someone doesn't believe in that at all, then frankly, that person will not be interested in tuning into that news spot. So it's the same with writing papers. You have to have a clear reader in mind. That's the only way that you're going to be able to really create effective boundaries around an argument, and the only way that you're going to be able to really think about a stasis, because people walk around with different ideas about how things work, and you can't reach everybody. So going back to our first question, what does my reader think about this topic? That helps frame how you're going to present an argument to a specific reader, and it helps to get that reader in mind. Now that's not to say that you can't change your mind about your reader. You may start with thinking that you're going to be writing to one person, but then writing for another. Maybe you think that your paper is going to be addressed to a teacher, but instead it's going to be addressed to students. How would the stasis change if, let's say, if the topic were school uniforms, and you were writing a paper for your teacher versus writing a paper for your fellow students? In fact, the stasis would change significantly, I would imagine. Teachers and students might very well have very different ideas about school uniforms. Okay. Another question you can ask that gets at the destabilizing condition is, what is incorrect or missing in that belief? What's flawed? Is it old? Is there a gap? So you find something that where you can find a space to challenge what the reader currently believes, so that you create, again, a space for your claim. Okay, the next question, what are the consequences of that belief? What happens when readers continue to believe what they believe about a particular topic? You know, what's a credible cost? In the case of the aspirin example, fatality, that people could die, that was a credible cost. But you know, death isn't a credible cost, let's say, for something like school uniforms, right? Perhaps a credible cost is that, you know, students won't be able to express their creativity. And maybe that's a serious enough consequence. Likewise, we can ask, what are the benefits of the claim? So what if the student says, you know, we should not have school uniforms? Okay, what's the benefit of the claim? Well, perhaps the benefit of the claim is that students will be able to express themselves, students will be able to maintain their individuality. And that, you know, is a reasonable and, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Credible claim or credible benefit of the claim, given, you know, provided it's the right reader, right? Okay. And then finally, what do I want my reader to believe or do instead? That question gets directly at what the claim for the paper would be. All right, so I've presented these 4 questions that can actually help guide the reader in their thinking in developing their topic, their argument for their paper. Okay, I should also mention that in the same way that the components of problem don't necessarily need to be presented linearly, these questions don't have to be approached in a linear fashion. Maybe the writer is really clear on the claim. Maybe the writer is really clear about the fact that they think that school uniforms are bad for students. Okay? Maybe that's where they start, and then they can go upwards. They can then say, well, if I believe that, what would my reader think? Okay? Or maybe the writer is thinking that they already know what readers think about a particular topic. Okay, then start there. Or maybe you're really clear on this destabilizing condition. So in other words, answer the easiest questions to answer first, because that might actually inform answering the other questions. And once you're able to answer all of these questions, you will then be able to structure an effective introduction, which will then help guide the reader about what the text of the paper needs to be. So, you know, if I'm arguing about school uniforms, I might need to come up with research that shows that, you know, in some cases it's good, in some cases it's bad, depending upon what I'm arguing, and that's what the following paragraphs might be about. So coming up with an introduction, at least to start with, helps suggest what the rest of the paper will look like. Now, I should say, starting with introductions doesn't mean that you have to actually use this introduction in the final product of your paper. This is where we have to allow a working introduction to give an indication of what the structure of the paper should be, so that we can at least begin. However, at the end, the paper may change significantly, and that might in fact suggest that the introduction itself needs to be changed. So there's no reason why at the very end this introduction can't be tossed out in favor of one that becomes more relevant to what the writer actually wrote. So we're talking about creating a working introduction here at the very beginning, and not necessarily the final product. I want to be really clear on that. This is using guiding questions to create a working introduction so that we can have some sense of what our entire paper should be about and how we might argue a point or a claim that we're trying to make. All right, so that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for your attention. I apologize that it took so long to get this presentation out. I am putting my money where my mouth is and learning how to incorporate technology in making this presentation perhaps a bit more interesting than just seeing a PowerPoint. I have also included here my name and the nonprofit organization I co-founded. We currently provide professional development to the Chicago Public Schools and other schools. So if you'd like to hear more about what you saw in this presentation, we would be happy to arrange for a meeting or PD sessions. If you'd like to hear more about other principles taught at the University of Chicago, we'd be happy to do that. We're passionate about teaching writing and think that this is a developmental process that even the youngest students can begin to get involved in, even if really it's probably the most sophisticated thing that a student can ever do. So thank you for your attention and good luck in teaching argument. Thanks.